First up, Starmer has finally struck a deal which could end the constant run of rail strikes we've gotten used to in recent times. But in doing so, he's made some members of the right-wing press go completely off the rails. Are union barons really now going to rule the country, or is the picture a bit more nuanced than that, despite what the rage writers might want you to think? Jonn, actually talk me through this deal then, and tell me realistically, do you think the government could have resolved this in any other way by offering anything less? Or had it got to a point where it's gone on for so long, they kind of had to make this offer?
I mean, I think it's the latter. So I think it's striking that the new offer is for a 5% backdated pay rise for 2022 free, 4.75% for 23-24, and 4.5% for 24-25. Now, you will notice that we are in financial year 24-25 now. Mm-hmm. So of this amounts to about 15% increase over 3 years, but 2 of those years have already happened. That kind of tells you about how much of a mess the network has got into, that this has been necessary, that you can't just say, okay, we'll raise your wages this year and next year and the year after. It has been necessary to kind of backdate it to get agreement. I mean, the right-wing press is obviously trying to sort of make it out like, a Labour government just handing money to striking public sector workers, while pensioners are starving in basements or something. But it does kind of miss the fact that firstly, under the last government, pensioners had quite a lot of handouts. That was very much their thing. And that was a pure electoral bribe. And the same newspapers were completely fine with that. Secondly, you do kind of need to do something about this wave of strikes that's been rolling since long before Starmer and co came to power. It's been there for a couple of years. And, we're in a time of high inflation. You can't just keep expecting people to put up with falling living standards. At some point, if you don't deal with the collapsing wages issue, it's not just... It runs into recruitment and retention problems. Like it's not just about what these staff are, quote unquote, worth. It's about whether or not you're going to have enough of them. And I think that's maybe less of an issue with the train drivers than it is with certain other bits of the public sector. But nonetheless, you do kind of need to actually think about workforce management rather than just kind of like the impact of the strikes and what you need to pay people.
There are still strikes going on, though. I was a little bit confused by this when I thought, they're all over. We've bound down to the barons here, and then I see new strikes happening. Can you just explain what is going on there?
Yeah, so I'm going to be honest. I looked at this. I don't think this is great. So this is ASLEF again. It's the same union. The agreement that's been made was obviously a pay agreement. This is not about pay. It's on one particular bit of the network. It's LNER, which is King's Cross and points north up to Edinburgh and beyond. It's not over pay, but conditions. It's about bullying by management and, quote, persistent breaking of past agreements. So they're going to be striking over 22 days across the autumn from the end of August until the 10th of November. It's basically every weekend. All the reports I've seen of this do sort of say this is separate from the pay deal. They don't say it in the headline. Noticeably. I do wonder if ASLEF is overreaching here, because I do think like the optics are probably not brilliant. It is obviously a separate issue, but nonetheless, if you want the government to be nice to you, you kind of have to play the game a little bit.
Hugo, this question of Labour having totally lost control of the unions, I mean, they've agreed something, so it feels slightly more in control than the Tories, doesn't it? Unless, ignoring them and letting them strike for forever constituted being in control. What do you make of this arc they've created around the storytelling of it?
Yeah, I mean, lots of strikes is losing control. Fewer strikes is gaining control. I don't think there was ever going to be a situation where the sort of the opposition turned around and said, "Oh, well done, Labour. They've totally sorted that out. We never could have done." Yeah, I see why people voted for them now. I mean, the fact that the new wave of strikes over conditions, which are not over pay, are not linked, that's worrying. I think that's worrying not because it shows, muscular unions, Labour isn't going to be able to cope. All governments fight with unions, Labour governments as much as Conservative governments. That's worrying because why are they not linked? Who in the government sat down to negotiate this stuff and didn't be like, oh, hang on, there's another wave just around the corner. We should rope that in or else we're going to look foolish. So somebody's clearly sort of dropped the ball there, just in a logistical, management-y kind of way. Yeah. And that I find sort of almost more worrying. The government is going to battle with the unions. Governments always will. Labour governments will give a bit more to the unions. That's why people vote for them. So, I mean, I don't think this is a sort of a huge looming disaster. But in pure management terms, it does look sloppy.
Yeah, is that the concern that there's a continuation of this this mismanagement of the unions, as you say, in some way in the relationship there, because them being emboldened per se by, as you say, Labour being slightly more generous towards them, they're not also been just simply emboldened by the fact there's been this massive stalemate for a long time, and Labour obviously wanted that to be done.
Wanted to end, but also, I mean, Starmer's in a slightly weird place with unions. His relationship with the unions is not super generally, and I think there is maybe a danger of, in his willingness not to look like he's in the union's pocket, not to give them special treatment, that he's just not going to fix fights that he could fix if he sort of hugged them a bit more.
Yeah,
you know.
Zoe, what do you make to that then, the link between Labour and the unions at the moment? Because it does feel like a complete talking point that they're somehow in hock to them. But as Hugo pointed out there, I don't perceive that to be the reality necessarily.
Yeah, and there have been points of conflict between Labour and the unions, prior to Starmer getting in government. So there were two kind of main flashpoints over the past year. The first was on the net zero transition and Labour's green pledge, which they eventually watered down. The unions were very nervous about this, especially the unions representing oil and gas workers. They were worried about how this would affect their workers, how it would affect pay, and just the uncertainty of the Green Pledge put a lot of pressure on Labour, as well as the Tories applying pressure on the figure specifically. But the unions were also concerned about that. And we actually saw Labour back down a little bit on that as a result of those two things. The other was obviously the workers' rights stuff. When there were rumours back in May that Labour were planning to water down their workers' rights package, Unite, the union, were particularly punchy on this. They said that if Labour were to retreat on this, it would be seen as a betrayal. They said the New Deal in its current form was unrecognisable. Really, really punchy towards Labour about this. So we know it hasn't always been a sort of smooth sailing relationship, and it definitely hasn't been the case that Labour have always done exactly what the unions want. As always, there are some unions which are way more supportive of the Labour Party than others. There are some that have been much punchier. Unite, for example, is one. And then there's unions such as G&B, which have been kind of more supportive of, and the TUC, which have been more supportive of the Labour Party. In this particular case, we can tell that ASLEF is, particularly happy about the deal. They sent out a statement. Lou Haig, the Transport Sec, also sent out a very positive statement. But there are still things, to come. We know the relationship with the BMA, the British Medical Association, has been quite tender. Wes Streeting's come in very punchy about junior doctor pay and the need for NHS reform. And although last week, I believe it was, there was a meeting and the BMA said the meeting was positive, they haven't ruled out further strike action. And there's still a sense that could continue to bubble over. So I think it really depends on what specific union you're talking about. But there's always going to be this back and forth, this push and shove between Labour and the unions, which is what Labour actually has to do when it's in power, and how far the unions believe they can push the party until, for example, they lose public support. And I think, as Jonn was saying, ASLEF's further strike, it's going to be hard to keep the public on side with that, because there's already a lot of furore about the number attached to the current pay deal. When there's another set of strikes on the rail line, it's really hard to bring the public along with you. So the unions also have to be aware of that. They can't just keep pushing Labour, because there's still public support there. And particularly this time when the public are really mindful about the state of public services and public finances.
Jonn, there's constantly feels like there is this comparison of Starmer to Blair, and the right-wing people will use this when they wish as a bit of an insult there. But should people actually be looking to that comparison a little bit when it comes to dealing with the unions then? Because if he is some sort of New Labour, reimagined Blairite style prime minister, Blair was hardly a pushover with the unions, was he?
Tony Blair did introduce legislation that required employers to recognise unions when their employees voted for it. Mm-hmm. That got watered down a bit from the original manifesto, thanks to the input of people like the CBI. And a lot of people on the left look back at it and think it was not all it was cracked up to be. But yeah, Tony Blair actually didn't have the worst relationship with the unions, but I had to look all that up. I don't remember this from the time. And the reason I had to look all this up is because it was a completely different set of economic circumstances. Strikes are very much a function of inflation and, cuts. And that was just not what Blair presided over, largely because it was a much more benign economic environment where you could offer a pay rise every year, where you could keep investing in public services. It's not so much about how similar Starmer is to Blair as the complete difference in in circumstances. I hate to say it, but I think probably kind of, if you're looking for a period of industrial strife to look back at, I think the current situation looks far more like the 70s than it does like the turn of the millennium.
This unions versus pensioners debate, which is coming out, it's just a survival strategy from the right-wing press in some extent, isn't it? You look at the Express, for example, and they want it to seem like we're setting pensioners against working-age people. Whether that is in any way useful or not, they want that because that helps sell the papers the increasingly small number of papers which they sell.
Yeah, it's completely that. Old people are much more likely to buy newspapers.
Well, they're also much more likely to vote Conservative.
Yeah.
Like the average Conservative voter is sort of like 411 or something these days, isn't it?
So like this is, I think, probably the most... It is the piece I've written that's been quoted back to me most often. It's a piece I wrote in February 2023. I was basically saying like, the right-wing press are screwing the Tories over and nobody's realised it. Because like they were kind of like lulling them to this lovely false sense of security that, well, maybe they'll still win. You can still do it. Like cheering the Tories on as they kind of run towards incredibly unpopular policies. And that's a slightly cynical act. The reason they were doing it is because the people with whom, say, Liz Truss's budget looked like it might be popular with for 5 minutes were the older people who read newspapers. So, like, once upon a time, if you kind of looked across the piece of the British press, you got a sense of what Britain was thinking. And you just don't anymore because so much of the British public no longer spends money on a newspaper every day. So I think, like, there is a danger for particularly the Tories, but also for the government in kind of looking at press coverage and thinking, the electorate is not happy with us, rather than this particular segment of the electorate that tends to be sort of older and richer than the average.
Are the sums of money as well that we're talking about here simply just different too? It costs a lot of money to end the strikes, but then the winter fuel allowance also costs a lot of money. And it does feel like this government is quite... It's got a direction it's planning to go in, and it's going to go for that, whatever different backlashes there might be. And these, again, it's not a case of one versus the other. It's a plan. They might get some backlash, and there we go.
Well, yeah, like the Tories, broadly speaking, were backing pensioners because they were their voters, but also they had an ideological interest in a smaller state. Whereas Labour, its direction of travel is almost certainly going to be they want workers to earn more, they want public sector work to be good, and they want a bigger state. That is just how our party system works. So, like, obviously part of this is a necessary thing because of the economic situation we're in. But also I think probably there are a lot of people in and around the Labour government that just thinks public sector workers deserve a pay rise.
Hugo, this on the backlash though that is mounting around this the winter fuel allowance. It does feel at the minute they've always got the get out of jail free line when they cut anything of saying, well, it wasn't our fault, we're doing this because of the last government. Is there going to be a tipping point where people question the ethics around doing that continually, and when can that time come? Because it's something I don't necessarily 100% agree in it being done, because there are people who fall through the net, and there are some more well-off pensioners, but there are plenty of very badly off pensioners, and unfortunately they're the people who get hit the hardest by this. The blame game, we've spoken about this in the podcast before, seems to be continuing. Does there come a point where that will fail to be the argument?
No, I mean, politically, look, it's harsh to say, it doesn't matter. There's not going to be an election for 5 years. They can kind of do anything. Then what are they going to lose? I mean, there might be the odd by-election pending, but not really. They have enormous leeway. We were talking about the Blair government. People always go back to the Blair government and say that the Blair and Brown's big regret was not doing enough quickly while they had the capital to do it. I mean, Keir Starmer's government could be like the most unpopular government Britain has ever had for the next 2 years, and ultimately it makes no difference. So I think there's an awful lot of stuff they're just not going to bend on. They'll be much, much, much more worried about rebellions from their own backbenchers, about government resignations, none of which is going to happen over this kind of thing, than they will be about any sort of pushback from the right, I think.
If there is going to be any time then to capitulate to the unions, if that is something that's going to happen, if there are going to be more and more requests going in, is that like pulling off a plaster then? Do you think there's maybe some logic to them going, let's agree these things, it's going to throw loads back to us, but then we can see what the state of play is, and then, as you say, politically get out of the way.
Kind of another way of looking at it is if you believe that public sector pay needs to be higher and that the unions have a point, which I'd imagine most members of the Labour Party, and certainly in Parliament, do, now is a good time to do that, because however bad it looks, in a few years' time, politically, it won't be so salient. People will have largely forgotten. You can get it done now. I mean, you can be ridiculed for. You might be ridiculed for it in the press. It might give whoever you're standing opposite in Parliament something to shout at you. But none of that matters at the moment. I think we've grown so used to being in a situation with a constantly precarious government that we've fallen into the trap of thinking that's how politics is, and there can be a fatal blow that brings the government down. It's not going to happen. They're there for 5 years.
Also, functionally, we do not have an opposition at the moment.
Yeah.
Zoe, then more widely on the economy and on this kind of these weird perspectives going around at the minute. It feels like we've been constantly told out that Reeves is making things seem to be worse than they are, and that seems to be a new line that's come out. Is it actually that maybe the window of what is bad has shifted a little bit after such a prolonged period of being misguided about just how bad the financial situation in Britain is? And so what she's saying now might seem quite doomish, but that's because we've had a long time of boosterish comments around it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the goalposts have been shifted. We've had a decade of essentially economic instability, austerity, repeated crises, a pandemic, inflated energy prices, war in Europe. People have adjusted to lowered living standards, suppressed wages, worsening public services. And, it's like the boiling frog. Like once that happens and you're in it and, you can turn the dial up and people kind of get used to it because they have to. I think also the right-wing press, because as Jonn was saying, it was working overtime to try and save Rishi Sunak's skin, was talking up minor improvements. So, it would downplay the severity of some of the economic challenges we were facing and focus on sort of specific data points. So, slightly lower inflation, while ignoring those bigger, broader trends like stagnant wages, like cost of living crisis. Also we saw a lot of cherry picking of international comparisons. So, the government would say, well, we're doing better than this country, or, we don't want to be like Poland or whatever. And it was, ignoring actually what life was like for people in this country. And I think, as we know, and a really important point is that economic hardship always impacts the worse off. And when you look at the people who are writing the news and who are editing the news and who owns the Telegraph and all those kind of things, those aren't the people who really know what it's like to be at the very, very sharp end of declining living standards in this country. And I think if you don't have those real life experiences represented, what it's really like to be a single mother on benefits with 3 children and facing a cost of living crisis, then it's very easy to dismiss how that impacts people. A lot of people talk about rising mortgage prices. That's when we really started to pay attention because the middle class were being squeezed. But for a long time before that, really poor, precarious people were dealing with really extraordinary cuts to their living standards. So, yeah, I think it is a sense that the goalposts have shifted. And now when Rees comes in and says, oh, it's really bad, and we've been told actually it's getting slightly better, it feels like, people are already used to that set of circumstances. So it's quite hard to believe.
Jonn, so on things getting better slightly, you're a lover of American politics. Let's say you've written about that recently.
Not in 2024.
Is going, is following a kind of American supply side model then economically? Is that going to work for us? Because that's something which is being discussed at the moment.
So yeah, there is this thing floating around called modern supply side economics. The original supply side economics was very much a sort of right wing thing. It was neoliberalism. It was Thatcher and Reagan cutting taxes and so on. The modern version is basically Joe Biden's Green New Deal. It's like government investing a load of money in the important things to kind of like set a direction and pump prime. And that does seem to be influencing the government's thinking a little bit in that, we have our own version of the Green New Deal. It's a bit titular, but it exists. But also things like the planning reform stuff. The idea is that if you make it easier to build things and you kind of like put a little bit of government money behind stuff, then more private sector investment will flow in. And the lack of that investment is one of the reasons we have fallen behind economically. And there's all sorts of reasons for that around, austerity and Brexit and just the general sense of instability. But nonetheless, I think the strategy is basically like giving the private sector more certainty to invest. It's a lovely theory. I would dearly love this to work because it sounds brilliant. But a couple of issues with it, one of which is we do not have the global reserve currency. So, like, it's not quite true that we're in danger of becoming Greece circa 2010, as we were once told. No. But nonetheless, there are limits on what government can do. That means that the sums of money being splashed around are titchy compared to what the Biden administration managed to do. And the other thing is, like, as it stands, looking at Reeves' plans at the moment, public investment is actually set to fall. So I have limited faith in whether or not this is going to work. I do wonder, though, whether, like, it's not actually supply side reform we're getting at all. Like, I wonder if there is some thought about the fact. I have had this theory for a while that one of the things suppressing the economy is the fact there was this massive weight bearing down on public sector wages. And that's, 30-40% of people in employment work in the public sector. If you're kind of bearing down on their wages, then firstly, there's less incentive for private employers to pay more to compete. And that means there's less incentive to kind of invest in plant and equipment to kind of make companies more productive. So I wonder if actually sort of like that deliberate attempt to kind of suppress wages by the state has had a knock-on effect elsewhere. And if we kind of unleash that a little bit, then maybe we will see better growth rates. This is probably me being a bit Panglossian, but I do kind of wonder whether higher public sector wages is actually kind of part of the plan.
Hugo, finally on this section then, with that, it being kind of part of the plan, it does seem like when we talk about the unions and the way that they come to agreements, that it couldn't be that maybe Labour do somewhat sympathise with them and maybe perhaps just agree with them. How much do you think the actions we're seeing at the moment are highlighting Labour's priorities versus how much is just pragmatism?
I mean, they do. It's priorities. It's both, obviously, but it's also priorities. Labour does have different priorities. Left and right is a real thing. We haven't seen it much in policy lately. But it's like responding to what Zoe was saying. I think it's fascinating when you look at why the Tories started caring about the cost of living when it started hitting the middle classes, started hitting mortgages. That's not, and I'd put this, that's not just because they're bastards, right? There's philosophy there. The even quite moderate Tories would believe when the poor are struggling, oh, well, sucks to be poor. That's why you don't want to be poor. The real issue, they would believe, is when the middle classes start struggling, because that means the system's not working. Because as far as they're concerned, the system is if you're poor and that's a problem, you stop being poor. But if when you stop being poor, it still doesn't work, that's the real problem. Labour doesn't think that. Labour sees that, that it is a problem at every stage of society, every socioeconomic bracket, which means when they engage with the unions, for example, who are not exclusively but largely representing the poorer members of society, they're doing it because they actually think what happens there matters for its own sake, not because of just the impact it has on everybody else. And that's a major philosophical difference and a major sort of difference of priority, which I think is going to have impact over the next few years.